Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis. Today I am joined again by Phil Lollar and Paul McCusker. This is our third installment of The Studio. And today's episode is about plotting and pacing. So, what makes for a good story when it comes to plotting and pacing? So, when it comes to plot, we see that the plot or the story is a promise. The author promises certain expectations to the reader. Now, if the longer you delay fulfilling any or all of the promises, the higher the expectation the reader is going to have, to the point where you reach a critical mass where you can never realistically satisfy the reader's expectations for the promises. So in one sense, you could maybe feed out little bits of fulfillment until you get to the big payoff at the end of the book, though that's not the only way to do it. But you definitely don't want to do like a bait and switch. Like, for example, a lot of didactic stories, like, for example, the TV show Designated Survivor, is set up as this awesome thriller with the guy that played Jack Bauer. And then they kind of do a bait and switch, and it's more like a, PC, let's hold hand sessions. And it's like, well, wait, that's not what you were selling us. You weren't selling us that. So, I mean, if you sold us that from the beginning, that would be different. But I do feel like there's a bait and switch there. But the other thing is, there's typically three parts to the story, and we can get into these a bit later. Of course, the beginning, the middle, and the end. And the middle is notoriously the hardest part. As far as general rules, I like to go from the general to the specific. Don't use Deus Ex Machinas a lot, because it ends up becoming kind of lazy. Case in point, the Foundation trilogy, where Asimov sets up the Harry Seldon's philosophy and scientific history to the point where characters can do any sort of ridiculous thing, and they're never going to pay the cost for it because the dead hand of Harry Seldon. Which, I mean, it's like, well, come on, guys. There's got to be a reason why it comes out in your favor. Like maybe not doing stupid things in the first place. I think in the end of the first book, the Merchant Princes, they literally march on the capital of the Empire. It's like, there's no way you're going to win, guys. And they know they're not going to win, but they also know there's no penalty for trying, which just seems lazy to me. You also don't want to have subverting expectations for the sake of subverting expectations. That's become kind of a trope, which ultimately breaks up the flow of the story to the point where it's, what even is the story in the first place? Now, that's not to say you can't do it, but to do it well, it needs to be part of a larger point. Case in point, in the New Testament narrative, the king comes, Christ comes as in humility in a way that nobody expects. You think of a king, you think, of trumpets and armies and a great palace, and there's none of that. So the expectation is subverted, but in a way that serves a more important point, not just for its own sake. And this also generally didactic stories, not didactic, but preachy stories tend to be bad plots. One exception might be Starship Troopers, but I think the difference is you already know you're going to get a lecture with that. Heinlein isn't hedging his bets. He's saying, look, this is a lecture to get you to join the army. And it's straight up. Whereas a lot of other stories, it's not straight up, and you feel like they've pulled the rug out from under you in a way that's not really satisfying. And so the last thing I'll end up with the big ideas is when you set up like a system of rules or expectations, don't immediately renege on them. Like case in point, Philip Pullman in his Dark Materials trilogy, and then I only read the first book, The Golden Compass. He literally sets up numerous in-game or in-book rules and conventions that he immediately breaks without any consequence or without any second thought. I'm like, well, what? You just broke a big promise there, buddy. So just to cap up the big ideas, the story is a promise. You need to fulfill it satisfactorily to the people that are reading it. These things like subverting expectations and Deus Ex Machinas in and of themselves aren't a problem, but if you rely on them for their own sake, it becomes a problem. So sort of that is a sort of a starting point. Why don't we begin with you, Paul? What are some of your thoughts on what was mentioned here?
Well, I think you covered it all. So thanks. I'm glad to be here, and it was great talking to you. And we'll see you next time. But I mean, it's hard to. I mean, there's a lot that can be added in the sense of your premise, obviously, the plot as the execution, the fulfillment of the premise, and as you say, it's expectations and fulfillment. Arguably, any climax is something like an almost predictable, inevitable surprise. I mean, predictable is the wrong word, but an inevitable surprise. In other words, it's fulfilling whatever that you've set up. The one thing, though, that comes immediately to mind is, and I think, Phil, you can jump into this too. It's that sense of story. It's not one master plot. I think any story that is singularly guiding or taking readers along strictly for some big end will lose most of its audience, especially since audiences now are fairly ADD. But the idea is that every plot has subplots and subclimaxes and moments that will fulfill along the way, or either reverse situations to create a new expectation. So you have your master idea, the master goal, the I don't know, the journey, the quest, whatever it may be. But along the way, you've got to have those reversals, cliffhangers, all those things that will keep the audience engaged all the way through to the end. Because if you think people are going to be patient enough to stay with you to just some end, I think you will have lost them long before you ever get them there. So that would be my immediate thought about some of that.
Well, I would agree with that for the most part. I think that you can have an overarching main plot that people are looking for and want to see fulfilled,
and should.
And it should be fulfilled. I think, the original Star Wars trilogy just comes to mind immediately, setting up the idea that there's this guy who, needs to take on the worst power in the universe, and that worst power ends up being his father. And how does that all play out? But of course, like you said, there are a whole lot of smaller plots and subplots and whatnot along the way. Now, what you're talking about here is really interesting to me, because we're talking about stuff that Aristotle said, of course, 3,000 or 4,000 years ago, beginning, middle, and end. Paul, you mentioned reversals, which he called peripeteia, the idea of a reversal of a situation. Usually that comes fairly early in, but there could be multiple points of that along the way, along the story arc. But it usually comes in, if you all are familiar, with, of course, with the hero's journey as well, as the idea of there's an ordinary world. The hero is in the ordinary world, and then something tragic happens that shifts that ordinary world completely out of whack. And then, of course, you'll have several more of them along the way. If you're a good storyteller, you're not going to just do the one and then have everything spiral out of control based on the one. The idea behind this, of course, is that you've got the character who has a dramatic need, and you've got to put obstacles in their path to achieve that dramatic need. It all boils down to a very, very simple equation. I also thought it was interesting, Todd, when you mentioned about Deus Ex Machina, and what's very interesting to me about that completely is that the greatest story ever told, which is our redemption in Christ, is all about Deus Ex Machina.
Yeah, I want to add one caveat to that, Phil.
Literal God machine, literally coming down and saving us.
So. The one point I want to add to that as a caveat is, if you have a backstory to your world building where such a being already exists that you can make sense of, but you haven't yet revealed to the reader, that might be a good way to reveal that being. But most people don't. When they have a Deus Ex Machina in a story, it's not a part of a rich world that's already been built before they wrote the book, and this character is introduced that way.
Right.
It's usually they painted their character into a corner that they can't get out of, and they just use it lazily to get them out of it.
Right. Exactly.
Well, and there was Captain. It was a Jude Law movie, came out several years ago. Captain, I've forgotten something.
Sky Captain in the World of Tomorrow.
In the World of Tomorrow. Now that to me was a great example of. I could not figure out, for all the visual of that, which I thought was amazing. I couldn't figure out why, when I got to the end of the movie, I was actually frustrated and thought it had failed. And I finally figured it out, that every time the characters were painted into a corner, because it's done like a Saturday matinee thriller sort of thing. Every time they got painted into a corner, they were generally rescued by some external force, not through their own ingenuity, not through that. It was some external force that came in and saved the day for them. And I kept thinking, you get that once or twice, but when it keeps happening, it becomes lazy, predictable, and there's no more suspense because you always know that they're going to get out of it. By the way, I think the gospel story is Deus ex humana rather than machina. It wasn't God in a machine; it was God in human form. So, and even then, everybody involved didn't know how it was going to turn out. So,
yeah, God came down and solved the problem.
Yeah.
For us. So I think the Jude Law film that you're talking about, though, was that, I didn't see it. Were they spoofing the whole idea of those Saturday?
No, it was done as a kind of thriller, and I mean, it was well cast, it was well done, and they used that sort of 1930s Superman style, the animated Superman style in terms of a lot of the look, the machines. It was very retro looking, and it was done set up like that kind of Saturday morning matinee.
Homage to that, then, do you think, or this is
it was a tip of the hat to it, but again, the problem was they were always rescued. Most of the time, it wasn't their own ingenuity that got them out of it.
This is where I have not a problem, but this is what I find always interesting about the Indiana Jones movies, is that people take them way too seriously. These were always meant to be an homage to a different kind of film. These were never meant to be taken seriously and literally, and yet everybody, in world building, which is of course what we're talking about here, the idea behind it is that all of a sudden we have this world, and Indiana Jones is the main character in this world, and Indiana Jones can never be, he faces setbacks, but he always rescues everything. Everything always comes out clean and dandy at the end. And so when you get to films like The Crystal Skull, or when you get to films like the Temple of Doom, and they turn out the same way as basically the other ones did, he's the good guy and he wins and he gets the stuff and he gets the whatever it is and takes it back, the elixir, and he gets to take it back to whatever, wherever he's going back to. Everybody's like, oh, but come on, he's doing this and he's surviving a nuclear blast inside of a refrigerator. Yes, of course he is, because that's exactly what the movies are supposed to be. It's not supposed to be anything more than that. It's an homage to a different.
But isn't it beholden? It's interesting you say that, because I was thinking, when somebody does something like that, but you don't know it, or you're in a generation that can't even have that as a point of reference because you didn't grow up with Saturday matinee, so you don't know that's their intention. How does the writer then, or the director, help to nudge the audience in the direction of what it is? Because, I put it on us as creators that if it misfires, that we're doing an homage to something, but the audience doesn't know that, and then criticizes us for the rules that we followed, that just simply followed the rules of the genre we were following.
Yeah.
How have we not set up the right expectation? How have we not allowed for that, either as a joke or as a wink, wink, nudge, nudge, or as we're doing it seriously, but it still is fitting that? I mean, the danger with the Indiana Jones thing, of course, is like saying you've created a murder mystery and, it had a murder in it. I mean, it's part of the genre, but isn't it incumbent on us as the creators to figure out how to clue in, especially in an audience that isn't initiated in the depth, wealth, or history of film or storytelling or whatever, with what we're trying to do? It's like Hail Caesar, I think, was kind of like that. The Coen brothers created something that wasn't a typical Coen brothers situation. It was something else, and I think it bombed for the most part because people didn't get what they were trying to do.
Yeah, but
so who's that on?
People
ultimately?
Get what the Coen brothers are trying to do. So,
well, okay, that's fair. And those guys are obsessed with kidnapping, but that's a whole other conversation. I don't know why kidnapping appears in every one of their movies, but whatever it is. But I mean, and I guess that's the question. How do we clue? I'm sorry, go ahead.
I was saying Raising Arizona is the whole film is based on kidnapping.
Well, but I went through, that's what threw me, because then I finally watched Big Lebowski or whatever it is. There's a kidnapping in that. Hail Caesar has a kidnapping in it. Yeah. And I kept going through thinking, all right, is this an ongoing theme in every one of their movies? I don't know that there's one in Miller's Crossing, but I'd have to think about that one.
Right.
Which may be my favorite of their films, but that's
would you count Matty Ross being kidnapped at the end, or is that just being held hostage?
I don't know.
That would be in True Grit. That was the 2011 film.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not really a kidnapping. She's just held hostage to
But
buy.
see, it wasn't their story. See, they were adapting someone else's story.
That's
Is what I
true.
was thinking there. So that was a bit different.
That's something different. I think you can fall into two categories with that. That they'll take because Oh Brother Where Art Thou is the same thing. They were following the Greek,
Right. That's true.
of stuff. So they weren't really kidnapping anything. I think their original stories, they just like going out of the box and
wherever they were. But I mean, it's like Spielberg. Spielberg always seems to have a lost child in his.
Now they did No Country for Old Men, right? But there was no kidnapping in that one.
Yes.
I don't remember.
Technically, there wasn't. Again, that was based on other source material. So
right.
I'm thinking in terms of the ones that they created, generated, etc.
Yeah.
But I could be wrong.
No.
But anyway, going back to that, I'm curious about that side of it, since we're talking about plot, because as you're moving into a plot, you're also deciding what your genre is. And then there are rules of that genre. There are expectations. If it's a murder mystery, sci-fi, fantasy, whatever the rules are that technically we're following or obeying or we're breaking in an informed way, it goes back to the earlier statement about expectation. You create a murder mystery and there's no murder in it, or you create something and the audience doesn't know, or we haven't told them enough to, and I don't mean spell it out, I don't mean dumbing down, I just mean giving them right nudges so they can figure out what in the world this thing is so they can respond to it accordingly.
Yeah.
Does that make sense? Because Indiana Jones even began with that 8-minute segment of outrageous the cave sequence with my daughter and I watched it not too long ago. And when my daughter's 18, but when the boulder is coming down after him, she said, well, why didn't he just stop and let it go over top of him? I mean, why did he run in front of it? But then again, we said, but in every movie, they run in front of the thing. Why do they run in front of cars? They're running straight down a street when a car is chasing them.
Well, I think that that never made sense to me either, but I think it was because he felt that it would trap him in the cave and he wouldn't be able to get out of the cave.
Yeah.
But
that's a good answer.
But on the other hand, the people who built all those booby traps had to have tested them at some point. So how did that happen? How did that even
lives were expendable, I guess. I don't know. But.
Maybe the next step would be, the stage one of the story, the beginning. Now, one of the interesting things is there are basically 3 conventions to starting a story. You start from the beginning. Most stories conform to that. You start at the end. So in the movie Gandhi and the movie Lawrence of Arabia, it begins with the death of the protagonist. Gandhi's shot and Lawrence crashes his bike.
What? I didn't know. Don't give away the end of these movies. What have you just done? Now you're going to tell me the Titanic.
And then we have beginning in the middle, which is what the Odyssey and the Iliad do. And so we have these 3 basic conventions for starting a story. None of them are necessarily better or worse than another, but some of them are more suited to genres. So beginning in the middle tends to be very well suited for an epic, even though The Lord of the Rings is an epic and it starts at the beginning with at least, the hobbits and the Shire. And beginning at the end, that tends to be really good for a well-known heroic figure like a Gandhi or a Lawrence. I mean, you could do Julius Caesar that way. It opens up with him getting stabbed, and then you tell the story about Julius Caesar's life up to getting stabbed. So those are really interesting conventions that have been around pretty much for as long as we've been writing these stories.
Well, I think when you're talking about beginning, middle, and end, the thing that we have to keep in mind also, and again, this goes back to Aristotle, is that the ending of one story is the beginning of the next one. And you could look at the first Indiana Jones movie as a perfect example of this. The whole scene in the cave is a climax of a previous story that starts this one. Introduces us to the unique character of Indiana Jones and all of the surrounding stuff that's going on. It introduces us to his main protagonist. And so that's what everybody marveled about when that film first came out, is that, oh my goodness, in the first 10 minutes of this film, it's more exciting than the climax of most other films. Well, that's because it is the climax of another story. Mm-hmm. It's a different story. Every ending of one story is the beginning of the next story. And we all, our whole idea, this is why I always try to emphasize that story is everything, because everything is a story. Our lives are stories. If you think about when we get up in the morning, I tell this to younger students. So you get up in the morning, what did you want to do this morning? What did you have to do? Well, I had to get to school. Okay, well, that's your goal. Now, you got up in the morning, you had to get to school. That's your dramatic need. That's your goal. And what happened in between all of that? Well, you had to get ready. You had to get breakfast. You had to get your homework. You had to get in the car. You had to drive. You had to whatever else. And all of those things may be big obstacles, big, huge obstacles that you have to overcome in order to achieve your dramatic need. Now, hopefully all of you did. You're here today, but think about all the stuff that happened to you along the way. And
Well,
now,
getting certain kids to school was a big dramatic thing in my house.
when you get to school, that's the start of the next story. It's the next part of the story. And you put link story together. At the end of the day, what happens? You sit down in front of at your dinner table or in front of your family or whatever, and they ask you a question. What's the question? How was your day? Now you get to tell the story of your day. This is what happened. Well, you put that all together. That's a day, and then a day links to another day. Pretty soon you have a week, and then a week links to all weeks all linked together. You got a month and a year, and then a life. Story is life. That's what it is. And sometimes we can start in the middle. Sometimes we can start at the end, like you say. But we're really kind of all starting at the end of one story, which is the beginning of the next story. And it's very interesting when you start taking a look at life as story, because it can really help you through a lot of bad situations in your life, because you think, well, if this is a story, I'm in the bad pit of despair right now. What comes next in the story? In a great story, what comes next? Well, either the Deus ex machina, or I'm figure out a way to get out of this pit, out of the bog, and I go to the next part of the story. So
yeah, well, and Indiana Jones is a good example of that in terms of what it does. Like if we're talking, if we're trying to give advice, for example, the brilliance of the best stories, whether they start at the end or the end of another story to begin the next, is the fact that it combines important information in terms of establishing the world, establishing the character, establishing a lot of things without the audience feeling like it's being established.
right.
Because we know bad exposition is, exposition in any form technically could be bad, but if you're going to communicate information, it should be attached to action or emotion. And Indiana Jones does that. Usually the best stories do, whether they're starting at the beginning. Hobbit was more traditional. Lord of the Rings was more traditional because Tolkien took the traditional route of, once upon a time, and he begins. There were these hobbits, and he begins to describe that world.
But even that still had that part was still the Lord of the Rings was still the end of the next phase of the Hobbit story.
Yes.
I mean, you had the hobbits. Yes, there were these people who live in a hole in the ground. That's the way that whole situation starts. But then it goes back with Bilbo, and Bilbo is the beginning of the Lord of the Rings, but he's the end of the Hobbit story. So,
and they started with a birthday. They started with an event. They started with something that would allow us to get to know him and his world and the setup for everything that was going to follow. So to your point, it was normal, but it was an abnormal normal in as much as it was a birthday. But
right.
Through that birthday, you saw what normality was, and then the disruption of that normality, which Pixar always says too, that you start your characters
right.
in some normal setting that is disrupted.
Yeah.
And then the disruption becomes essentially the next story. I mean, the story you're following.
Yeah, and that first normalcy that you're talking about, for instance, the birthday, we meet all the key players.
Yeah.
So we're meeting all of them. Basically, we're getting a hint of the villain, but we're basically getting a hint of all the people who are now going to go on an epic journey. And that's the whole idea. That's a great setup. It's a great classic setup. The Chronicles of Narnia the same way. What do we have? We have 4 kids. And The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, and an unusual circumstance puts them into a place that they normally aren't going to be. So their normal is disrupted by World War II, but they have to go to a place out in the country that's safe, and so they make a new normal for themselves. And as they're going through their new normal, then Lucy stumbles upon an even a bigger reverses her situation in a lovely way. I mean, it actually. What Lewis was brilliant at there, of course, was it disrupts. They were in a bad situation because they had to leave home because of a war. And so she goes in and has a lovely afternoon with the fawn, and they have tea and they have all sorts of other things. And so she's like, hey, this is the greatest thing in the world. But then all of a sudden, of course, they can't get back in for a little while. And Lucy is thought to be a little mad or crazy. And then Edmund, we all know the story. But that's the lovely, brilliant thing that Lewis did as a variation on that theme. So,
well, leaving one conflict, it's like jumping from the frying pan into the fire. That sort of setup where you've got a character who thinks they're escaping one thing normal. I mean, even Beauty and the Beast, it's this provincial world. I want to get out of this,
right,
then leads her into a whole other thing, which then comes back to, going back to the whole thing about plot, which is the execution then of that. I mean, you're setting up something, which is the world, the characters, the settings, all those things. But then your plot has got to take out and then fulfill the expectations because that was the big thing about Indiana Jones. And I remember the critics at the time marveling over the fact that, the first 8 to 10 minutes created can you top this mentality? It's like, wait a minute, if that's the beginning or the end of the other story. But whatever it is, how in the world are they going to go past that? I remember the Adventures of Robin Hood with Errol Flynn.
yeah,
They've done books where they have the script, but then they also have the behind the scenes debates and arguments about the structure. And one of the things they noted, one of the early drafts had the big pageant, the archery tournament was towards the beginning of the movie. And the producers wisely said, but you can't do that. This is all the pomp and pageantry. This is a big moment. You've put it early enough that how are you going to top that? What are you going to do? It's going to be anticlimactic. I don't know if others have agreed, but my problem with the original Jurassic Park was that after the T-Rex, honestly, a lot of the other encounters struck me as anticlimactic to that surge of energy and everything that went into the whole T-Rex sequence. So they tried to match it, but it was not quite more intense than that first thing. And then it made me wonder if maybe they had placed it in the wrong part of the movie. Maybe it belonged at the end. I don't know. It's not for me to second guess it, except to note we have to be very careful with what we do.
What's interesting about that example in particular, I was going to mention that Jurassic Park when we were talking about Deus Ex Machina, because that's a total Deus Ex Machina.
Well, that ending was. That was
totally.
T-Rex Machina. I mean, it was
exactly.
If ever there was a cheat of a climax, that was about as big a cheat as I've ever seen.
Yeah, absolutely. And the whole and really the whole reason for it was because Spielberg wanted that image of the banner floating right in front of the T-Rex.
Yeah.
Was terrifying because we've all seen that image when we were kids. I saw that image very similar to that one in books about dinosaurs when I loved dinosaurs way back when. Yeah. But that movie is it's a strange anomaly, that movie is, and I couldn't figure it out for the longest time because I thought there's a movie that really does break a whole bunch of rules and still is one of the most popular films of all time and still is held up as a grand example of wonderful filmmaking. Still marvelous when you think that he was making Schindler's List at the same time.
Right.
That's what's really amazing about it, but which is a brilliant storytelling, a wonderful story arc that he was able to tell in that movie. And then it dawned on me again. I go back to Aristotle. Aristotle had 5 points of good story, or 5 points of story. He said plot, character, what he called diction, which is dialogue basically, thought, which is the theme, and then the last two are spectacle and song.
Mm-hmm.
And I thought spectacle and song, that's really interesting because we can go over and over all of the elements of really great storytelling, which are the first four are all these wonderful foundations for great storytelling. But there seem to be some exceptions to the rule, and they're genre exceptions. And the genre exceptions usually are comedies. We talk about this. McKee talked about this too in his story structure. I don't know if you remember that, but he said this. He talked about this and said, the exceptions to these rules are comedies and musicals.
Mm-hmm.
He didn't say musicals, but I say musicals, and then adventure stories like this, spectacles that are all about spectacle, which is what we have mainly in films now.
Yep.
What we have mainly in films, everybody, I don't want to open up a can of worms here, but all of the Avengers films, all of these superhero movies, they're all spectacle much more than they are anything about story, plot, character development, all that stuff.
And arguably, by the way, they have to be. I mean, and it's funny how the business aspect weighs into this because CinemaScope was created because people were staying home and watching television. Now we have that phenomenon of people having great TVs at home, great sound systems. They made all of that more accessible and affordable. So how do you get people back to theaters? How do you get them to buy tickets except to give them spectacle?
Right.
So the days of the coffee table romance discussion kind of films are being moved over in many ways to other formats, whether it's Netflix or Amazon Prime or whatever,
Yeah.
because the spectacle is what's expected at the theater. Why go see something at the theater that you can see at home more readily and easily and not have to worry about where your bathroom break is?
Yeah, and that you can, thanks to Netflix, you can, if you really, which is what I do, which is why it takes me forever to get through a season of a television show that I really like, is to back up and go, oh, I want to see that scene again.
Yeah.
Absolutely, that was a well.
I know. I was in one of those. I think I was in Endgame, and I kept wanting to hit the pause and the rewind. There was no going there.
Now there was one point that you brought up earlier, Paul, about exposition. There's sort of like two rules that people say you should keep. Show it, don't say it, and avoid long-winded expositions.
Yep.
You see, some of my favorite works, like Moby Dick's, Herman Melville's Moby Dick, Tolstoy's War and Peace, and Tolkien's Lord of the Rings, have both. If you read War and Peace, it's just all this exposition on history, philosophy, the Freemasons, and hunting. Moby Dick is all this exposition on sailing and, cutting up a whale for processing, as well as the drama and the thrills of Ahab and Ishmael. And then, of course, Tolkien has these long, like the Council of Elrond, this long-winded exposition, but it really sets the tone for the rest of the book. So I wonder how much of that is just the ADD reading audience we have now, because some of that stuff is great.
Well, it is, but I will admit, reading Lord of the Rings, 50 pages of them going through a forest and a twig snaps, and I'm immediately hoping something is going to happen now. And it's only a twig snapping, but boy, that was exciting because nothing else was happening. And it's interesting. A lot of these writers that you mentioned could not get away with today what they did in their time. Because remember, the world was smaller. So the idea that you could spend pages and pages talking about somebody trudging through ice was because everything was being discovered. And often these stories were vicarious experiences to kind of take people to places that they couldn't hardly even imagine, whether it was crossing the desert, crossing the ice, whatever, or in a fantasy realm, and taking the time to describe that world for them because it was fascinating. Even in a dreamscape situation like Lewis Carroll, or when you get back to George MacDonald and some of those, the journey was a big part of it. It wasn't any climax or the end. It was the delight of what they were encountering along the way. But see, we're in a different age where CGI, there's so much stuff that has been shown to us visually, often beyond things that we would even imagine, or in some cases wouldn't even want to imagine. And it's fascinating to me because that informs our expectation about stories now. So after the Marvel universe with 10 years of that, superhero movies have now fundamentally shifted and changed in people's expectations because Marvel adjusted those expectations. It's the same thing. I think we're up against that on all sides, and being ADD is part of that, of course. I don't know that we have the patience anymore for long exposition. Anyway, it just doesn't make sense.
I would say that the caveat that I would say about exposition, the generality, I think about saying that exposition, we want to avoid it as much as possible, put it into the action of the film as much as we possibly can, or put it into the action of the story. So that way it's, Lewis does that brilliantly I think in the Last Battle, where he talks about as they're marching through the forest to go to confront the bad guys at the shack. All sorts of other tales of Narnia were told. He goes into a few of them here, there, and everywhere. But I think what we want to say is exposition. Yes, try to put exposition into the action of the story. Absolutely. But there's nothing wrong with good exposition. If the exposition is well told, if the exposition is well written, and the exposition itself is exciting and it's stuff that you need, because we've all seen that too. Like you said, Todd, I think going back, I can't remember films right off the top of my head, but if there are really fun ways of telling the backstory, I think Quentin Tarantino does this really well, where he'll the one that I'm thinking of now that I'm thinking about it is in Kill Bill, where he goes back to when I'm going to ruin this, when the bride goes to visit. She's tried to kill the guy in the trailer at this point, and he blows her away with a shotgun and then buries her alive. And then what do we have? Well, we go back in time to a story and we get all sorts of exposition about how she's going to get out of this. And how does she get out of this? Well, all the training that she had with the master here, doing this, doing that, where she's breaking boards 3 inches away from her, breaking boards 3 inches away from her. The whole exposition of that, the whole telling all. Now, he could have just said, he could have not done any of that. But that exposition was actually very well done and very well timed. But it's all
Victor Hugo did that, of course. He'd spend pages and pages talking about the sewers under Paris.
Yeah.
And then the punchline is that a character is running through the sewers under Paris. And now you understand. Right. And Clancy did that. Clancy was
he was a master.
Famous for that. He would then tell something technological early on, but he was smart enough to know that it had to happen early.
Yeah.
So that when you get to the big dramatic moment where that piece of equipment or whatever is being used, you're not stopping the flow of action to explain what the piece of equipment is because he explained what it was earlier. And the truth is, and you and I know this from audio drama, the further we get away from a known reality, the harder it is, and the harder we have to work to get people into that. I mean, for me, narration is a last resort. But as we move outward from a family in a living room, and then you begin to move either back in time to periods that most of our listeners would not know, or we move into realms that they can't know, whether it's talking animals or alien forces or whatever the case may be, we then have to work harder with what we do with our exposition short of stopping everything.
Yeah.
In order to give it, in which case it feels disruptive and annoying that we had to do that. So the phrase burying the exposition, either by attaching it to action or emotion, or attaching it to something. So even Tarantino is brilliant because, and I say that reticently, Tarantino created a cliffhanger in order to do the exposition.
Sure.
So, and that also is valid. That's a valid way to do it. You've created a situation, and how is this person going to get out of it? And then go backwards to create exposition. I'll tell you who cheated, and I could not believe that a modern filmmaker would do it, was in Ant-Man and the Wasp. There is a scene in the middle of this movie where a key character, everything stops for this character to give all this exposition that wasn't attached to emotion. It wasn't attached to anything. It was a long, let me just explain what you can't know, what the audience can't know.
Yeah.
And I was astonished that the Marvel producers allowed that, because it was boring and disengaging, and it was hard to even recover from it because the exposition wasn't even that interesting. I hate to admit.
Was it necessary though?
Well, some of it was. But it's like they couldn't quite figure out. And I kept thinking of, whenever I disengage from a movie or anything and begin to try to fix it in my head, that's a bad thing. Watching something and my brain goes, if they had just done this, or they could have done that, and I begin to work through alternatives, then I have now moved out of my suspension of belief.
That's kind of a side topic, but it's very interesting. It's the same principle as seeing nudity in films. When I see nudity in films, I'm not thinking about the film anymore. I'm thinking about that person had to get naked.
Yeah.
That person had to.
And there were 60 people standing around while this person had to do it. It goes,
I'm out of the story. But one other thing about I think another person who was brilliant at exposition in what we're talking about is Douglas Adams in The Hitchhiker.
Yes.
He understood the formula. The formula, I don't want to say it's a formula, but he understood the principles of it, which is make it funny.
Yep. Make it entertaining.
Do something with the exposition. This goes back to what we were saying about before. The exposition is fine as long as it's good exposition, as long as you do something with it, make it funny, make it exciting, make it interesting in a different way. And I think that good filmmakers and good storytellers, and we were talking about film, but Todd is also talking about books. Both of them, and we talk about audio drama. I think we've tried to do that in audio drama too. There's just sometimes there's no way around getting a narrator involved. Well, if you're going to do that, then you better make the narration worth listening to.
Yeah.
Don't
Or
just
you create a character that can do it. I mean, the narrator of the Hitchhiker's series was a character unto himself.
right.
So when he went off into exposition, it was entertaining and funny. And in Odyssey, I've often noted that our best character for exposition is Eugene,
Yeah.
because you kind of expect it. And so of all the characters that we have, he's the one that can get away with it, because it's inherent in his being verbose and over explaining and all of that. And it works. So I guess that's to argue in favor. If you have to, if you're going to, then make sure that whoever's delivering that is so interesting as a character or
Right.
as a device that the audience doesn't mind. It doesn't even feel like exposition because they're with whoever the character or device is.
Yeah, and speaking of plot, I'm going to go back for just a second. So you talked about the Adventures of Robin Hood, the Errol Flynn version, and where they put that arrow, that shooting contest.
Yeah.
Where did you put it in yours?
Oh, it came in the drama. I put it later. I had to be careful. I mean, I structured to build towards it, but in a way, it wasn't really the climax, or it wasn't like the big moment, because there were other things happening around it.
Right.
And so the big moment really is at the end, which is in essence a very big battle. I mean, unlike Robin Hood, which became sort of a contained thing. I mean, it was still a huge conflict in the movie, but yeah, I built towards a different place, but that was one of the key steps along the way.
Right.
Well, one thing next is the part that a lot of writers, whether it's screenwriters or novelists, crash their ship on, is the middle. Because a lot of people think that the middle, is the boring part, because you're not setting up characters and you're not wrapping everything up. Obviously, two ways you can use the middle effectively would be the character is set up with some flaw or struggle to overcome before he can do the great deed, and therefore you spend the middle where he has that lone knight in the cave to overcome whatever that problem is. Or you could have evil ascendant, in which case Star Wars Episode 5 is both. Luke has to overcome his youthful childishness, and the Empire's ascendant. Now, you don't have to do both at the same time, but that's one way you can do it, because that's sort of the middle of the story. And so I think what makes the middle hard for some people is they want to go, it's like that South Park, start this, ... finish it. It's like, well, you gotta get in the middle, and people don't like to think about how to connect the dots. I think in part, this gets to something that I think it was Heirloom Productions, Paul, you were interviewed by one of the guys from there. And the idea is, a lot of people just don't have the grounding in philosophy and logic and clerical thinking to be able to have a step-by-step process to link things together. And that's partly why I think the middle's hard. Because if you look at 19th century literature, again, at least the stuff that's famous, that's continued, the middles seem to be very, let me put it this way. If you look at the 19th century, there seems to be fewer plot holes in novels than there are now. Like when they set something up, as you go through the middle, like, for example, War and Peace. I have no idea how Tolstoy kept track of over 200 characters, and all the stories came together at the end. And I'm usually nitpicking plot holes. There just weren't any. And today, even like a 200-page novel has tons of plot holes. And I think that's really where the middle breaks down, because what ends up happening is you chuck stuff, which then creates plot holes, which then overall ruins the immersiveness of the story.
Well, I think people become impatient with their own world, and you almost get that. It's a sense that they can't wait to get to the big, exciting finish. So they're just doing whatever they have to do to get to the finish. And you sense that impatience. You sense either the lack of skill or knowledge or technique to get through. Because to me, the middle is probably as important, if not more important than the end in many cases, because you have to connect the dots. You have to keep them engaged at every point. I mean,
I love it better than I like the beginning and the end, actually.
Yeah.
I really enjoy it a lot.
Because you're getting into it.
Yeah, Sid Field talked about it as well. He talked about in screenplay, his book Screenplay, he talked about the three sections of story that you're talking about here, and he calls them the setup, the confrontation, that's and the resolution, which is the end. So the idea behind, if you think about it that way, then you realize, okay, that's what I need to be doing. instead of just saying, oh, this is the middle, I got to get through this in order to get to the big climax, you're saying, no, 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 this is the confrontation. What is the character? What is your character? Your multiple characters in some cases, but especially your protagonist. What are they confronting? What's the confrontation? What do they have to do? What are they learning about what their goal is? And that's what's wonderful about actually that middle section, because you find out a lot of times that's where the change takes place, where you're surprising your audience. You're setting up all sorts of stuff that can play out in the climax, and they think the climax is going here, but lo and behold, you've set up all sorts of stuff in that confrontation that can go in any direction.
Yeah,
and so
it's
that's what you're doing here.
It's having cards to play. I mean, I've keep realizing the best stories always have a number of cards to play, and like you just said, and it can go any direction, and yet the best stories wind up in a direction that hopefully is satisfying. It fulfills it, but it got you there in an unexpected way, even though it was fully expected or hoped for. And all of that has to happen in that confrontational middle section. That is the problem. Writers who think of the middle section as kind of the boring bit, I think don't understand their own craft or how important it is at every step. But that is the opportunity to do all the things that could ultimately end to a satisfying conclusion.
And on top of that, when you think about, for instance, stories that you read as a kid, or even films that you saw as a kid, or whatever, I'll give The Chronicles of Narnia as a great example of this. It's the one that I can pull off the top of my head, but I also think when I used to read the Boxcar Children, I used to love those stories. I was right in the middle of all those. When you finish the story, what is it that you really loved about it? Well, you're disappointed because you're no longer in the story. You finished it, and you go back and you say, oh, I really would love to be, wouldn't it be great to live that way? Well, where in that story would you like to live? You want to live at the end of the story, or would you like to live at the beginning of the story? Probably at the beginning of the story. That would be nice, but really where you want to live is the middle of the story. You want to live in the middle area. That's the world you've created, and so why do you not want to live there?
Yeah, case in point, the Voyage of the Dawn Treader. The middle is the most interesting part.
Yeah, exactly.
Right, because you got all these weird magical islands you're engaging in, whereas the beginning is kind of boring because Eustace is really annoying, and the end.
But he needs to be.
He needs to be annoying because that helps him grow in the story. Yeah. But it's really that middle part where he becomes a dragon, where they find the lake that turns things into gold because it takes on your greed. So the middle is really the most interesting part of the Voyage of the Dawn Treader.
Yeah, yeah.
Well, and that's the other thing. I mean, about all of that is that when you have what you just talked about, and we've seen it again and again, when a story ends and you have that sense of longing, and it's not a sense of longing as in the story was unfinished, but ideally people like the characters enough to want to continue to hang around with them. Yeah. People like that world enough, or the world that it has become, that in theory the world has been saved. So nobody wanted to live under an oppressive regime, but hopefully by the end of the story, it's been thwarted, vanquished, defeated. And now we want to move in and hang out with those characters in this new world, or whatever the case may be. And it's hard to try to explain to writers, and I struggle with it myself, in how you balance being edgy, in other words, keeping the unpredictability, keeping a certain harshness or whatever it is that world needs in terms of conflict, and having characters that are engaging enough. You identify with them, or there's something about their personalities that draw you in. My struggle with Breaking Bad, which many people tell me greatest television series ever made for whatever reason. And I have 3 times now continued, stopped. And right now I'm in a stopping point. So I'm not seeing the whole series because I keep going back to how much I really care about what happens to these characters.
Yeah.
And it's difficult. And I know it's a morality tale. I know there's a lot of things going on, but I keep thinking, I think I needed more nudges. I'm not sentimental about this stuff, and I'm fine with characters with edge and even villains, but even the villains need to be compelling. Something about them, The Godfather being an example, where technically you're rooting for a bad guy or someone who's not as bad as somebody else, but
That's the key. Yeah.
You're still engaged enough to care about what happens to them. And I think that's the other thing about the middle section is I tend to try to write, not always successfully, but my mind is always on the question at any point, why should the audience care? I never believe that we should bank on the goodwill of our audience, which many series have done to their undoing. That you don't count on your audience's goodwill. Oh, I can get away with this because they're with me. What you do is you have to keep going. I keep going back to, why should they keep caring? At what point do they quietly, we used to say that the thing that we feared wasn't the criticism that we got with Odyssey or anything we worked on, but it was the quiet turning off of the radio, the quiet, they faded away because they lost interest. So for me, it was always a question of, why do they want to stay engaged? And I better keep giving them good reasons to stay engaged. And I don't mean tricks and devices and magic stuff. I don't mean contrivances. I mean, from the get-go, it's got to be characters, a setting, a world that would be compelling enough to keep them going through on the journey with me.
And that's where we're talking about all of these great principles of storytelling, these foundational principles, which we're hitting on all of them. And of course, again, we could go for hours and hours, weeks, and lifetime, where everybody, you never really learn these things completely. That's the beauty of being a writer. It's a continual learning process. But now I think what you're hitting on is theme. What you're hitting on is, do you have a compelling enough theme to keep everybody wondering about that episode, to keep everybody engaged in that episode as the characters going through confrontations, as the characters going through that whole middle section, as the characters are developing and you're learning new things, and they're confronting their own world, they're confronting themselves, they're confronting the obstacles that are ahead of them. How do they get out of this situation that they're in? What's the next obstacle? How does this all build to a climax? So you're talking about, why should we care? Well, we care because there hopefully is a grand overarching theme that touches our very humanity.
Mm-hmm.
We are going to face this in our own lives in a different way, different context, but we're going to face this in our own lives. What can we draw from this story, which is what we've always tried to do with Odyssey, by the way? What can we draw from this story that if I'm faced with this situation, I will be able to look back and go, oh, that's what they did.
Yeah.
Oh, they stood firm. Oh, they did
We're
this.
constantly modeling behavior, one direction or the other.
And constantly, returning to those epic, universal, ultimately very, very human, themes that speak to the human condition and how we're supposed to behave. How then shall we behave, as Francis Schaeffer talked about? How are we supposed to do this? Well, how should we live? And that's where that middle section is value. That's all about it. That's what it is. That's what.
And then that comes back to the other subset of the whole discussion, which is pacing.
Yeah.
So the pacing of that, the ebb and flow, the tension, the release of tension, the setbacks, where the setbacks go, always has to maintain plausibility, credibility, all of those things, either introduced or where you're going. But pacing, it's a hard thing I find to talk about, because it varies from every story. Every story has its own choices and challenges anyway, which is why you can have a great writer write a bomb. You can have a Steven Spielberg misfire, because the questions and answers, the choices and challenges you have on every project, you can misstep at any point. And pacing is one of those things that I've always wrestled with, because it's intuitive. I don't know that anybody's actually spelled out a formula for good pacing, because it's all subject to your world, your characters, your plot, your theme. Everything is based on tone, mood, what you've created with this scene leading to the next scene leading to the next. And you can go too long, it's Goldilocks and the Three Bears. I mean, how do you get that just right?
And that's exactly why we don't want formula. We want form.
Yeah.
I mean, again, going back to Sid Fields, we want form, not formula. We don't want, I understand there are people who are going to swear by this, but we don't want Save the Cat. We don't want these. I enjoy reading all of those books, and I enjoy reading through like the Pixar model for how to make a great film and tell a great story and whatnot. I enjoy reading all those types of things, but I think, okay, here's where people get into trouble, because they look at their own story and they say, okay, by page 3, this has happened in that story. That means by 3 on my story, I better make that thing happen. By 3 minutes in, this needs to happen. 3 to 10 minutes, this thing needs to happen. Well, if you're building cars, that works. If you're in an assembly line, you're building Model T Fords, you're going to be able to you better make sure that you have that assembly line up and running, and every Ford's going to come out the exact same way. But that's not the nature of stories. That's not what we're doing here. So you want the form of storytelling. You want to be able to say, okay, let's deal with the foundational elements of plot, character, dialogue, theme. Let's deal with those kinds of things. Let's make sure we have good, all of those things are present. And then we would talk about how are we going to develop our plot? How do we develop the structure? And you and I have been to countless seminars about this and have given seminars on this. And it really does come back to the idea of exactly as you're talking about. Every story is unique in terms of its own pacing. How does that play out in terms of its own pacing? But it still comes back to the basic form of saying, look, you've got somebody in their own world, in their own situation. They have a reversal of fortune. They have a reversal of situation. They have, and sometimes that reversal of situation is due to their own fatal flaws. They make a bad choice and it causes a reversal of situation. And now they have to get out of it, or now they have something new that they need to do. Now they're catapulted into a different world. And now their obstacles are faced to try to get back to, and it's the story of the garden, in the Garden of Eden, good grief. I mean, the whole of humanity wants to get back into the garden. We made a fatal error, a bad choice, and we had a whole role reversal, a terrible role, and now all of humanity is like, can we get back? How do we get back? What are we supposed to do? So that's, those are all those kind of things that deal with pacing and plot. How does that go along? How do those things work out in their own time? And at Sidney Sheldon Leonard, who created I Dream of Jeannie and was a great novelist and whatnot in his own right, said, you're never so much like God. A writer is never so much like God as when he's facing a blank sheet of paper. And how you have to create the world. It's your characters, your pacing. You decide how to do it. And it gives you a greater appreciation of Scripture when you do this sort of thing, I think, because you realize, what does the Bible say? The Bible says God's perfect timing. Christ came when he was supposed to come. It was his perfect timing. Well, that was thousands of years. Everybody was saying, how long, oh Lord, how long? But he came in his perfect timing. His timing was perfect. So, that's that we apply that to us. We're imperfect creators. He's the perfect creator. We're imperfect creators, but we still mimic our perfect creator. And we say, this is how this works. This is what's supposed to happen on the page.
Now, I guess the last thing we need to get to is the ending of the story. Now, generally, there's the more conventionally acceptable, you wrap everything up and you're done. That would be like a single novel. If you want to write a trilogy or a story arc, then you might leave it open for another story. So the ending of the Fellowship of the Ring opens up to the Two Towers. Sometimes you have the subverting of expectations. Sometimes it's done well, sometimes it isn't. Two subverting of expectations that are kind of interesting is at the end of Starship Troopers, it ends right at the high point, right when they capture the brain bug. It's like, it's done. And you're like, well, how do you beat the bugs? But beating the bugs isn't the point of the story. The story is Heinlein's view of civic nationalism and sort of civilian military. Another good example of a really weird ending is The Sword of Doom by Kihachi Akitomo, and where there's this great samurai duel that's about to happen. And one of the villain samurai, who's the protagonist, gets a lot of people mad at him, and they start chasing him through this inn, and it looks like he's going to die. And then it just ends. The good samurai that wants to get revenge on the bad samurai, we don't know what happens with that. Is the bad samurai going to escape the people that are out to get him? It just ends. When I first watched the movie, I was furious. But then I watched it again, understanding what that expectation was, and I began to appreciate it for what it was. So
but see, that's a key difference, though, because you watched it again. There's a lot of people who wouldn't watch it again. There's a lot of people who would end and go, I don't know what he's trying to do, and frankly, I don't care. I just wasted 2 hours of my life. I mean, it goes back to expectation, fulfilling expectation. Of course, you do have groups of writers and filmmakers who came along and purposely deconstructed, thwarted, threw out certain rule books, for better or for worse. There are some examples where they did it effectively, and others where you just go, wow, that was so French. But I just spent 2 hours with people I didn't like to an ending that made no sense to me. But Cormac McCarthy did it, of course. No Country for Old Men being an example of that. He defied.
Well, he copied that film, by the way. He copied.
So it completely defied all expectations in many ways. He just did things that drove me crazy. I mean, I got to the end of that, or towards the end, and just simply could not work out what I thought of this, whether I ever wanted to see it again, whether I even cared to think about it anymore. And there were a couple of other movies like that, but sorry.
But his point was nihilism at the end of that film.
Yeah, exactly. So
thing I think you have to take into consideration, I didn't mean to interrupt you. The one thing you have to take into consideration about the film that you mentioned, Todd, is we can go back to, let's go back to a second for what you mentioned, Paul, which was genre. You're talking about the difference between Eastern storytelling and Western storytelling. And the march of Western civilization is very linear. We are very linear minded. We want the beginning, middle, and end. We want the beginning, the confrontation, the climax, the resolution. Whereas in Eastern storytelling, they don't particularly follow that pattern. They'll follow a pattern to a certain degree, but it's perfectly within the realm of Eastern storytelling to say, okay, you know what? We're not going to resolve this. This is not because in Buddhism, if you know anything about it, if you even tend, I don't know a whole lot about it, but I know a little bit about what the thought process is. We're all emerging from a oneness. We all do things and we just blend back into the oneness. And the idea behind all of that is, there's not necessarily a climax where everybody gets their comeuppance and the bad guys get their comeuppance and the good guys win, or even the good guys lose.
Well, it's the difference between the first Matrix and the third Matrix. Yeah. So, yeah, actually, there are probably examples of those two examples: Western versus something.
Yeah, Oriental versus Occidental, basically, is what we're talking about here. And so a lot of people will watch those films and think, oh, great, a samurai film. We're going to see a lot of great fighting. Oh, yeah, woohoo, it's going to be great. And the good guys are going to win because, hey, look, we've all heard George Lucas and Steven Spielberg, all those guys loved, Kurosawa, and they loved the way he did Seven Samurai, and that's what they're doing now. And then that film, the bad guys get their comeuppance, and that film, this stuff happens. Well, yes, but Kurosawa was also influenced by Western filmmakers before he made that film. So again, the ending of one story is the beginning of another story, which is the beginning, which is the ending of another story. But the idea behind all of that also, though, is if you look at a lot of those kinds of films, Eastern films, you'll see that they can be very frustrating to Western mindsets. Very frustrating because we don't look at stories that way. We look at stories differently. I happen to think, call me prejudiced if you like, that the march of Western civilization actually is a better way of telling stories than the Eastern stories. And the reason why is because God set time into motion, and God set time into motion one way. He did. We love the idea of time travel to be able to go back and forth through time and correct our mistakes and everything else. But the idea behind it is, when God said that God created the heavens and the earth, he put everything in motion, it goes one way. Time goes one way. And I think that storytelling reflects that. So Western storytelling especially reflects the idea of we have this start, we go through these conflicts and terrible things and awful things happening, and we know the ending of the story, we're redeemed, and the good guys win and the bad guys lose. And so I think that all of our stories in the West are sort of reflecting all of that. It's when we play around with that. It's fun to play around with it. It's fun to play around with the idea that the things just end, that things just kind of go away. We're all gonna blend into one. Back to the.
But it may not make a good story, and it's and you want to try that, but then you can't. Then you can't complain why the audience, bailed on you or whatever. And again, we're going back to expectation.
Yeah.
In terms of expectation and the ending being fulfilled expectations, even if it's in an unexpected way, you're still dealing with the promise you made and whether you kept it or not, and whether you didn't. And again, this doesn't suggest dumbing down. It doesn't suggest cheating or just contrivances. We're expecting something compelling, something intelligent, creative, plausible, credible, all of the things that we would expect for a story.
Yeah.
And the fact that it comes to a particular ending that you might have even said, oh, well, I knew it was going to wind up there, but you still delight that it wound up there because it's what you really wanted, for the characters to live happily ever after, or if not live happily ever after, having fulfilled a particular mission or destiny or whatever the case may be. And then you even have an ending, for George Bailey in It's a Wonderful Life. That was not the ending that was satisfying to him in the way. I mean, his whole goal was getting out of Bedford Falls.
Yeah.
But then he learned something greater than his own desire, and then we go from there.
Sure.
But it fulfilled that.
Yep.
We kind of went with that, and I don't know of anybody who hit the end of It's a Wonderful Life and went, yeah, but he should have gotten out of Bedford Falls. Doggone it, there's something wrong with this movie.
Well, when it comes to fulfilling an expectation while subverting it at the same time, The Return of the King is excellent because we all expect Frodo to get rid of the ring. We all expect Frodo to be the hero. But of course, at the end, the ring seduces Frodo and it's Gollum. But it works because throughout the entire series, it's foreshadowed that Gollum has an unexpected role to play. Right. So we do get the ring destroyed. Sauron's defeated. We get the expectation, but it's done in a way that when I read it, I didn't expect Frodo to, this was before The Return of the King came out. I read the entire corpus. So I didn't expect Frodo to be the one that falls and Gollum to save. So that's really like a gold standard of how you do that.
Yeah, I think you're right. I think that that's a great example of the twist of the unexpected. But yet, what you were saying earlier, Paul, which is the inevitable surprise.
Mm-hmm.
It's inevitable, and because when you stop and think about it, you the reader or even the storyteller has the ability to step outside of that world and say, well, what else would Gollum do if he didn't?
Mm-hmm.
How would Gollum exist in a world with no ring in it?
Mm-hmm.
How would he ever do that? Would that even be possible? Would he be able to be redeemed? Would that even how would that? I mean, it might be an interesting story, but his soul was so corrupted by everything that it wouldn't be possible for him. It was also almost a mercy to have him fall into the Mount Doom.
With the thing that he most wanted. He finally ultimately got the thing that he desired, and it destroyed him.
Could you argue, Paul, that that's kind of like from Dante? Because, right, if you read the Divine Comedy, hell is getting what you want.
Yeah.
Do you think that's kind of Dantean flavor there?
Well, and Tolkien and Lewis, all of them explored that very idea. That was part of the human condition that they then put onto Gollum. Yeah. And it also highlights that mysterious thing that we can't get our brain around, which is that evil serves a purpose to good in many ways. Even though the whole time evil is trying to undo good or corrupt good, somehow in the economy of God, we even have suffering, setbacks, strife, tribulation, and evil playing its part in the bumper cars of our lives that send us off into directions that we otherwise wouldn't have gone, that serves his purpose. I mean, it really is. It's like the end of Terminator, where you just, if you really try to think it through, you're going, this is crazy. It makes no sense. And yet it makes perfect sense. But that's the providence of God.
Which is why the book of James tells us to rejoice in all of that.
Yeah. Exactly.
That's where we get deeply philosophical with this. That's where the confrontation comes. That's where the middle scene comes in. That's where the middle of a story comes in. That's why we rejoice. That's why we look at that and say, yes, that's exactly it. That's exactly what we're supposed to do. It's not fun to go through any of this stuff, but ultimately, if you look at your life in terms of story, your own life in terms of story, that's being plotted by you and the creator of the universe, you realize, we have to go through these things. These things are necessary. Jesus said, trials, tribulations, you'll have rumors of wars, all these things are going to happen, but that's just the beginning of birth pains. You have to be able to go through all of this stuff in order to be able to gain wisdom and to be able to understand what's being prepared for you later on, even on the mountaintop.
Yeah, that's the eucatastrophe, as Tolkien calls it. I mean, things can possibly get worse. So when Paul is giving farewell addresses in the book of Acts before he goes off to Rome and we know he's going to die, all you see in the life of Paul is one setback after another. And yet through those setbacks, the gospel was preached. The gospel was taken into the world in a way it might not have been otherwise, because the setbacks were part of it. And embracing them is, I think, the hardest thing for modern, maybe every Christian, but modern Christians in particular, who believe that God is here for us to be happy. But Jesus says a lot more about our suffering and the need for suffering. He modeled it.
Yeah.
More about that than anything about abundant life in the way a lot of people interpret it now, which is a whole other conversation. But anyway.
But it's interesting that I used to teach, I taught a course called Christianity and the Creative Process, and I had weekly writings for the students. And one of the things that I would always do, give them as a prompt, I would have them watch a video. Usually it was somebody who was in the creative world, either a musician or a writer or a filmmaker, somebody who talks about their creativity and what it takes. And I think there's a guy named Jack White who is a musician, and he puts himself in a box. I put myself in a box, and I have to get out of it creatively. I purposefully put myself into this kind of a situation, and so I relate that to read Acts 8:1, and the beginning of Acts 8:1 says there was great persecution at the church at this time, and the disciples were scattered, and it goes on to say something else after that, and so I said, now relate these two together, and the students come back to me going, I don't see how this relates. How does this relate at all? And so we have these great conversations about this, because they say, would the church have spread if there hadn't been great tribulation and persecution against it in Jerusalem? They were in Jerusalem. They were all sitting around in Jerusalem in upper rooms talking to each other, and they're not doing anything that, the Great Commission is go into all the world, preach the gospel to every nation, and they're just sitting around talking to each other. And so God says, okay, got to give them a little nudge. Boom. Let's have some persecution here. Persecution. They got to get out. They got to move. They got to go other places. And when they go, of course, they're taking Christianity with them. They're taking the gospel with them.
And that's key to story, because basically we're constantly trying to move characters out of comfort zones.
Yeah.
Because if characters stay in their comfort zones, then you don't have a very interesting story. It's pushing them out constantly. If we're godlike as writers, we're constantly having to push people out of whatever the comfort zones are, and sometimes the readers too, but do so carefully and credibly. But it still has to happen. But again, like you say, story is life, and it's like life. Alfred Hitchcock said it's life, but with all the boring bits cut out. Right. So, and that's what we're out to do.
When they put them all back in.
Yeah, that's a different story. But yeah.
Well, we're nearing the end of the time that you guys have. So why don't we start with you, Phil? What are some of your final thoughts on these topics?
I think that I think we have to understand these foundational elements of story, and we really need to keep going back to them over and over again. So plot, character, dialogue, theme. Plot, character, dialogue. Dialogue can be communication. Dialogue is of a dual nature. We can get into this in later episodes, but the idea of what the characters say to each other, and then how the characters are communicating with us and the audience. And so we have to be mindful of all of those. A writer, a creator, a storyteller. I don't want to just limit it to physical writing, but a storyteller, which we all are. Songwriters are storytellers. Everybody's a storyteller. And if we have a tendency to forget those basic elements, with those foundational elements. We think we go beyond that. And the biggest complaint I get from students when I teach them, when they come back into my classroom and we start going back over this, well, I already know this. Oh, really? You do? You already know all of this. You already know everything there is to know about these things. Obviously that's just simply not true. There are people who have written for, whole careers, and decades of writing, and are very, very, very successful at it. And they still are learning new things about plot, character, dialogue, and theme every single time they sit down in front of a typewriter or a keyboard to write something new. So the idea behind it is, I think the thing I would leave everybody with is investigate those. Don't forget those. Go back to them continually. I knew a man who had studied music with a man who had 2 doctorate degrees. One was in vocal pedagogy, teaching music, and the other one was in piano. And he said, and he was conducting the choir that I was in. I was with him, and everybody used to complain about doing scales and practicing, and why do we have to practice so much, and why are we practicing this, and why are we practicing that? And he said, I have 2 doctorate degrees and I have to practice. So what makes you think that you shouldn't practice? The idea behind it is you never finish learning on this, and you always need to go back to those foundational elements. If you're having a problem with your story, if you're having a problem with what you're writing, if you can't think of something, you have writer's block, then chances are you're missing something in one of those 4 basic elements. And so you need to go back to those elements and explore them and examine them further. That would be the thing that I would leave everybody with, just off the top of my head. And again, we could go on for weeks and weeks and weeks and weeks about each one of those things.
Okay. Well, and writing on that, I would just say that the difference for me between an experienced writer and an inexperienced writer is the experienced writers can spot their mistakes sooner. And that to me is the key thing. It's not that they don't make the mistakes, they spot them sooner. And to what Phil just said, what we do is a merger. It's a combination of talent, imagination, and craft. And very often the craft part either gets emphasized to the exclusion of the necessity. I mean, you can't teach people talent, no matter how hard you try. They have it or they don't. And so you have a lot of people who can learn a craft, but they don't have that talent that goes further. So the combination of those is the need for what Phil just said, is the constant reminder of the aspects of bringing our talent to bear, our imaginative realities, our lives, what we bring to that, but the craft that gives it a framework that makes it accessible to everybody else. You know, the fact that it's something in my mind doesn't help anybody else until it actually engages in a craft and goes out and then becomes hopefully meaningful for them. And again, reiterating what Phil just said, within that is a constant reminder that we're in a learning curve. I mean, I said, I think before Phil came on, you know, I said, my learning curve, for better or for worse, is out there for everybody to see.
Yeah.
You know, when I engaged initially in church drama way back when, hardly anybody was doing it. So publishers went, oh, great, we got somebody doing it. Let's get it out there. And everything that I learned is on the page for people to see. When we jumped into audio drama, nobody was doing it. So our learning curve is out there for everybody to see. And I realized it's always true. My learning curve is out there all the time, because I hope that one day I can say, I think I've gotten pretty good at this, but I'm not even sure at this point that I feel comfortable saying it, because I don't think I have. Every time I think I've got something, somebody can point to me, or I can see in my own writing a published book, a new one. I can look at something and go, oh, you know, I didn't see that. I could have adjusted it by this much, and it would have been a better sentence. It would have been a better paragraph. It would have been a better plot move. I mean, any variation on that. So I don't know of any good writer who ever rests on their laurels. So keep learning, pull out Strunk and White's elements of style, or whatever it is that will remind you of, whether it's screenwriting or whatever it may be. Keep going back to the essentials and remind yourself of them, because we do forget very easily, especially when we're caught in the moment of creation, or we have deadlines, or whatever the case may be.
Well, and this, the other thing, just one last little thing here, is that there's no magic pill. This is what I really think some of my students are. They go, you're telling us things that we already know. And I go, yeah, but I'm not. It's not like I'm keeping it from you. It's not like I'm keeping. Oh, we've all who've had some success at writing, we're all going to hide the truth from you until you get a little bit of success, and then we'll give you the magic pill that will tell you, here's how to make a great story. Yeah, here's what it is. No. This is it. You have to either take it seriously or not take it seriously. Which is, which is what Stanley Kubrick said. You either care or you don't care. And if you care, then you'll be willing to go through the work that it takes to make this stuff happen. And understand, like Socrates said, the only thing I know is that I don't know anything.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, thanks again, Paul and Phil. This was an enjoyable discussion as always. This is Timeless.
Thank you.
Thank you.